I was 34 that year. It was late September of 2013. The mornings had started to feel colder, sharper, like they were trying to warn you about the winter ahead. I lived in Newcastle back then, but I'd been taking more trips out into Northumberland, especially up near the Cheviot Hills. I'd started getting into solo hiking and camping the year before. Something about being alone out there gave me peace that I couldn't get anywhere else. My job was loud and filled with people, so when I could disappear into the woods for 2 or 3 days, I took the chance. That particular trip, I planned to hike the back trails past Heathpool and then loop around a narrow path that dropped off near a place the locals called Bridge Hollow. I didn't know much about it, just that it wasn't an official route and that the Forestry Commission didn't really maintain that section anymore. It was marked on some old OS maps, but even then, it looked like a faint scratch through the trees. That was exactly what I wanted. A place that felt far from anything. I packed my rucksack with the usual tent, food, knife, stove, water filter, map, compass. I didn't like bringing my phone, but I had it switched off and tucked away, just in case something serious happened. I set off from my car at the edge of the forest near Kirknewton early on a Thursday morning. The sky was gray, but there was no wind and no sign of rain. The trail into the woods was quiet, and I didn't pass anyone. No dog walkers, no hikers. That's normal out there, especially on weekdays. Felt like I had the entire forest to myself. By the time I got about 6 miles in, the terrain started to get a bit more rugged. The trees grew tighter together, and the path was almost gone in places. I had to keep checking the compass and my bearings to stay on the route. It was late afternoon when I reached the edge of Bridge Hollow. There wasn't a real bridge anymore, just the old stone footings buried in ivy and moss. A stream ran under it, cold and quick-moving, with steep banks on either side. I decided to set up my tent about 50 yards from the stream, where the ground was flat and dry, nestled between 2 large boulders. I pitched the tent and gathered some wood to make a small fire, even though I knew it wasn't really allowed. I kept it low and surrounded it with stones. The sun started to dip behind the trees, and the forest began to change. That's something people who don't camp alone won't understand. The woods during the day feel peaceful, almost lazy, but at night they change. Every little movement, every rustle, sounds different when it's dark. Like the trees are hiding something just out of sight. That night, I didn't sleep well. I heard what I thought were deer moving near the edge of camp. Sticks snapping in the distance. Not close enough to worry me, but enough that I didn't drift off easily. I kept the knife close. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, it was morning. Mist hung over the ground, and the tent was damp from the dew. I ate a quick breakfast, filtered some water from the stream, and packed up most of my gear to go explore the deeper section of the hollow. The trees were even tighter here. Branches clawed at my sleeves, and I had to push through brambles in places. The path was almost invisible now, just a narrow depression in the earth that led down into a dip between the ridges. I followed it because I was curious. I wanted to see how far it went. About an hour in, I found something odd. There was a pile of stones not naturally placed. Someone had stacked them, flat rocks balanced neatly in a small cairn right in the middle of the overgrown path. It didn't seem fresh, but it hadn't collapsed either. I walked around it and kept going. That's when I started to notice things were a little off. Not obvious at first, just little things. I saw an old boot stuck under a tree root, its leather cracked and gray with age. A few minutes later, I found a rusty tin can nailed to a trunk, like a makeshift marker. There was nothing inside it. Then came the blanket. It was blue, torn and filthy, but draped over a low branch like someone had hung it there to dry and never came back for it. That should have been my sign to turn around, but I didn't. I kept walking, slower now, looking closer at everything. I reached what looked like an old clearing, though it had nearly disappeared under the weight of time. In the center of it was a collapsed wooden structure. Not a house, not a cabin, just a framework of logs that had once been something. There were rusted metal barrels beside it, one tipped over, half buried in leaves. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I walked over to the structure, curiosity pulling me in. Underneath one of the beams, I saw a scatter of bones. Not human. They looked like deer bones, picked clean. There was no smell, but it still made me uneasy. Something about the way they were arranged didn't sit right. I backed off and started making my way back toward the campsite. That's when I realized I didn't recognize where I was. I thought I'd retraced my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, and the ground was uneven. I checked my compass, but it was spinning slowly, twitching like it couldn't lock in a direction. I tried not to panic. I sat down, took a deep breath, and looked at the map. I marked where I thought I'd been and decided to cut east, toward the stream. If I could find the stream, I could follow it back to camp. I walked for another 30 minutes, maybe more.
No estream.
Just woods. Thick, silent woods that felt like they were folding in around me. That's when I heard it. A steady clinking sound. Metal tapping metal. Not loud, but rhythmic. I froze. It was close. Not right beside me, but near enough that I could hear it clearly. I crouched down behind a stump and waited. The sound stopped. I didn't move. After about a minute, I stood up slowly and turned in a circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. But then I saw it, faint, maybe 70 yards out through the brush. A shape, person, just standing there, facing me, not moving. I ducked down again. My heart was pounding. I wasn't supposed to be out this far, and no one else should be either. Whoever they were, they hadn't made a sound beyond that tapping. I waited, but the shape didn't move. When I looked back up, it was gone. I didn't know what else to do. I moved in the opposite direction, keeping low, checking behind me every few steps. The forest felt alive now, but not in a good way, like it was watching me. I kept moving until I finally heard the stream again. Relief hit me hard. I followed it downstream until I recognized the old bridge footings. I found my tent right where I left it. Nothing touched, nothing moved, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed everything as fast as I could. I thought about staying another night, but the idea made my skin crawl. I set off toward the main trail, following the route I came in from. I kept glancing behind me. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every gust of wind felt wrong. I walked for hours, not stopping to rest, until I finally made it to the car just before sunset. When I turned on my phone, I had no signal. I didn't care. I started the engine and drove out of there, only letting myself breathe once I was back on the road near Wooler. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in my flat, thinking. I reported what I saw to the local police the next day, not because I thought it was a crime, but because something about that place felt wrong. They took the report politely but didn't seem too interested. Just another hiker seeing shadows in the woods. 2 weeks later, I read a small article in a local paper. A dog walker found an old rucksack deep in the hollow. Inside was a notebook, a compass, a cracked pair of glasses, and a wallet. The name didn't mean anything to me, but the man had gone missing in 1997. They never found his body. I haven't gone back since. I still hike, but I stick to marked trails now. There's a part of me that still wonders what I saw out there. Maybe it was just a hunter, maybe someone living off-grid. But I remember how still they stood, how silent. I remember the bones under that collapsed structure, and I wonder if anyone else ever went that far in and didn't come back. The forest doesn't care if you're careful. It doesn't care if you're experienced or respectful. Sometimes it just swallows people, quietly, without a trace, and I was nearly one of them. I never liked camping in the rain. Most people don't. But when you grow up in the north, you learn to deal with the weather. You either push through it or stay indoors for half your life. That weekend, I pushed through it. It was early October, and I was already feeling the season change. The air had that bite to it, even in the afternoon. The leaves were turning, but there were still enough left to make the trees feel full. I had a few days off work, and I didn't want to spend them on the couch. I hadn't been out in the woods for months, so I decided to head back to a place I used to visit in my early 20s. A quiet stretch of forest land outside of Langenog, near an old river bend that cut through the hills. I packed light, just enough food for 2 nights, my tent, a tarp, a knife, my little gas stove, and the usual gear. Nothing fancy. I had no real plan other than to walk deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't hear any cars or people. That's what I needed. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the river rushing over stones. I wasn't chasing any deep peace or clarity. I just wanted the silence. It took me most of the first day to hike in. The trails were damp and slick with leaves, but I knew the area well enough. I followed the river upstream until I found the spot I remembered. The bend in the river where the water slowed and pooled in a wide pocket. The trees there leaned in heavy over the water, and the bank was soft enough for a tent. It looked just like I remembered. That was rare. I set up camp just before the rain came. It started as a soft drizzle, just tapping the tarp above me while I unpacked. I had my tent staked down tight, rain fly over the top, and a thick layer of tarp underneath. I kept the firewood under cover, even though it was already half wet from the hike. I got a small fire going with a fire starter and some dry twigs I found under an overhang near the rocks. The smoke twisted up into the gray sky, mixing with the mist that had started to crawl down from the hills. By nightfall, it was properly raining. Thick sheets, steady. Not a storm, but enough to make everything drip and cling. I sat under the tarp, listening. I ate some beans out of the can and a bit of bread I brought in a Ziploc. I didn't even bother warming it up. I didn't want to leave the fire exposed too long. It was dying anyway. That kind of wet will choke out any flame, no matter how careful you are. I zipped into my tent by 9 p.m. Everything outside was soaked. My boots were lined up just under the edge of the tarp, and my socks were hanging from the tent pole, damp but not dripping. I laid there on my mat, sleeping bag zipped up to the neck, listening to the rain hit the fabric above me. That should have been enough to put me to sleep. It usually is, but I couldn't sleep. There was this feeling I had, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite fear, just an edge. Like my brain wasn't fully relaxed. Like something was too quiet or too out of place. I figured it was just because I hadn't been out in months. My body probably wasn't used to being that far from home. Still, I kept turning over. I must have laid there for over an hour, eyes wide open in the dark. Then I heard it. Not the rain, not the wind, something else. A snapping sound, not like a branch falling, more deliberate, like something stepped on it. It was faint, but it wasn't far. Maybe 20 or 30 feet behind my tent, closer to the thicker trees. I held my breath. Then I heard it again. 2 slow crunches on the wet leaves. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a badger nosing through wet ground. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't sound right. Animals move differently, more random. This felt too steady, too careful. I stayed still, listening. The rain made it hard to hear much, but when it slowed for a second, I heard a rustle. Then another snap. Closer. I grabbed the knife from my bag and sat up slowly. I didn't turn on my torch. I didn't want to give away where I was in the tent. I listened hard. My heart was thumping by then. I don't scare easy, but something about those slow steps got under my skin. Then it stopped again. No more movement. Just the rain tapping on the nylon. Minutes passed, then maybe half an hour. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I laid back down, knife still in my hand, and waited. I must have drifted off sometime after that, but it wasn't deep sleep. It was the kind where you dream with your eyes half open. The next morning, everything was quiet. The rain had slowed to a mist. The woods were gray and still. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cold air. My breath came out in clouds. The ground was soaked, the tarp sagging with water. That's when I saw it. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, human, pressed into the soft mud about 20 feet behind the tent, leading in from the woods. They came in a curve, wide steps, deep in the heel. They stopped just a few feet from the edge of my tarp, then turned back the way they came. I froze. I walked over, careful not to step on them. The size was strange, narrow, long, toes spread like someone who didn't wear shoes often. I followed the prints back into the trees for maybe 10 or 15 feet, but they vanished where the ground turned rocky near the bend. There was no reason for someone to be barefoot in those woods. Not in the cold, not in the rain, not miles from any town. I packed up fast. I told myself I'd head back early, cut the trip short. I didn't even make breakfast, just rolled up the tent wet, stuffed everything in my pack, and hit the trail. I was on edge the whole walk back. Every noise felt too loud. Every bird call made me turn. It wasn't until I got near the base of the trail, close to the farm road where I'd left my car, that I saw something else that made me stop. A plastic bag was tied to a branch just above eye level, hanging like a marker. I hadn't seen it on the way in. Inside the bag was a strip of cloth. Looked like a shirt sleeve, torn and muddy. Under it, folded paper. I didn't open it. I just stared at it for a long time. I don't know why I didn't open it. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant for me, like it was some kind of signal. I left it hanging there. When I got home, I took a long shower and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. I didn't unpack right away. I just kept thinking about the prints, about the torn cloth, about how long someone would have to live out there barefoot for their feet to look like that. I never told anyone about it. What was I supposed to say? That some barefoot man walked up to my tent in the middle of the night and just stood there? But the part that gets me the most isn't the footsteps, or even the bag. It's that I never heard him leave. I heard him walk in. Snap, snap, rustle, then nothing. No footsteps going back. Only the prints told that part. And that means two things. Either he stood out there all night watching me and only left at dawn, or I fell asleep while he was still there, just a few feet away from the thin nylon wall of my tent. I haven't camped alone since. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just turned 32. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids. I was between jobs and had enough saved up to take a couple months off. I lived in Leeds at the time, and I felt the city had started to rot me from the inside. Everything felt noisy and tight and gray. I needed quiet. I needed to get out and just breathe somewhere I didn't have to hear sirens and buses and neighbors yelling through the walls. I'd always enjoyed the countryside, and I'd done a bit of solo camping here and there. Nothing extreme, just long walks through calm areas and pitching my small green tent somewhere off a walking trail. I picked a spot in the Peak District that I hadn't tried before. It was somewhere between Hope and Edale, kind of a nothing area, mostly moorland and woodland with a lot of open space, a few sheep fields and no phone signal. That was part of the appeal, really. I didn't want to be near people. I didn't want messages popping up or phone calls dragging me back to whatever life I was supposed to be dealing with. I brought a camping stove, dried food, extra socks, 2 torches, and all the stuff you'd expect. I left the car parked in a little lay-by near a trailhead and walked out for about 2.5 hours before I settled on a place to camp. The spot I picked wasn't a formal camping ground. It was just a little rise at the edge of a patch of woodland that sloped down toward a narrow stream. On the far side of the stream, the ground rose again into thicker trees. That was about as wild as it got in England, really, but it was enough for me. I had space, the sound of the stream helped me sleep, and the tree cover kept the wind from cutting through me at night. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and made a little spot for the stove. I was planning to stay 3 nights. I'd brought a paperback and a flask of whiskey, and I felt as relaxed as I had in months. The first night passed quietly. I heard a few owls and the distant bleating of sheep somewhere uphill. The stars were clear, and I sat out in front of my tent until it got too cold, just watching the sky and drinking from the flask. In the morning, I walked for a few hours along the stream and then cut across a few bridleways before looping back. I didn't see anyone all day. No hikers, no dog walkers. That was odd, but I liked it. It made me feel like I'd found a forgotten corner of the Peak District. I ate, read, and turned in early. It was the second night that things started to feel strange. I hadn't fallen asleep yet. It was maybe just after 10, and I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, torch off, eyes open. I thought I heard something. Not animals, not wind, something heavier than that. A snap like a branch breaking under weight. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. No footsteps, no leaves rustling. Just that one sharp crack and then silence. Could have been a deer or a badger, but I was too on edge to sleep after that. I lay there for a long time, eyes on the black ceiling of the tent, waiting for another sound. Eventually, I drifted off. I must have slept for a couple hours. I woke up around 3 in the morning to pee. I unzipped the flap of the tent and stepped outside. It was cold. The air had that sharp, wet smell that clings to your throat. The stream was louder at night, like the silence around it made it stronger. I walked a little way from the tent and relieved myself under a tree. And that's when I felt it. That sensation, like you're not alone. Not a sound, not a shape, just that gut-deep prickling at the back of your neck. I turned slowly and scanned the tree line on the far side of the stream. I didn't see anything at first, but then I caught something, some shape lower down, half covered by brambles. Pale shape, still and low. I thought maybe it was a rock or a bush, but I stared for too long, and it wasn't a rock. It was someone crouching. I could make out the curve of the back, the bare shape of a head. Someone was crouched low at the far side of the stream, not moving, watching me. I didn't move. I stood there frozen for what felt like 5 minutes, my feet wet in the grass, staring across the stream. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, a fallen log, a sheep caught in brambles. But no, I knew what I saw. It was a man. He was watching me, not standing, not walking, crouching, too still. I backed slowly toward the tent. I didn't run. I didn't take my eyes off the stream. I got inside the tent, zipped it shut, and lay down with my boots still on. I didn't sleep again that night. I just lay there listening. I didn't hear anything. Not one sound. No approach. No splash in the stream. Nothing. But I knew he was there. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped out with the torch in one hand, even though it was daylight. I crossed the stream slowly, boots soaked, and walked to the spot where I saw him. There were brambles, wet and thorny, and some broken branches behind them. The shape was gone, but the ground had been disturbed, leaves pressed down, small crushed plants, and deeper in I found a footprint, not a boot, barefoot, a man's foot, in mud, toes splayed. I felt a sharp cold drop inside me, like my organs tightened. Who camps barefoot in English woodland in early June? Who hides in brambles across from a lone tent and crouches without making a sound? I packed my things fast. I had only planned to stay one more night, but I wasn't going to risk it. I threw everything in my pack and crossed back toward the walking trail. The trail was harder to follow than I remembered, and it felt like I was walking in circles. I didn't see any signposts or fences, just endless uneven ground, sheep droppings and damp trees. I checked my compass and tried to head northwest. I figured if I kept that bearing, I'd hit the road eventually. I walked for maybe 3 hours. My legs started to ache. My pack dug into my back. I didn't stop. I didn't want to. The thought of stopping made me feel sick. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see that pale figure crouching behind a tree, but the woods were always empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. By early afternoon, I finally saw a stone wall and a gate. Beyond it was a wide sheep field and then a thin road. My car was parked half a mile up that road. Relief hit me like heat. I climbed the gate, crossed the field, and didn't look back. When I reached my car, I opened the boot, shoved everything in, and got behind the wheel. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I drove straight back to Leeds. That night, I didn't sleep either. Not because I was scared, but because I kept replaying that crouched shape in my mind. Over and over. Still. Watching. Too still. I tried to tell myself it was just some wild camper. Maybe some off-grid guy who lived in the woods. Weird, yes, but not dangerous. But that didn't explain the bare footprint, or why he hadn't moved, or why he was crouched there at 3 a.m., hidden and silent. I told myself I was safe. I told myself it was done, but it wasn't. A few days later, I noticed something strange. My front door latch, an old one with a top bolt I rarely used, was slightly off. Not broken, not damaged, just moved. My front window, the one above the sink, had a faint smudge on the outside. A handprint, maybe. I wiped it off and didn't think much of it. But that night, I checked every lock 3 times. I slept with the bedroom door shut and a knife on the table beside me. A week later, I came back from the shops to find my garden gate wide open. I always kept it latched. There were boot prints in the soil near the bins. Not mine. I bought a security camera and installed it above the back door. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the camera feed on my phone. I watched it until 4 a.m. That's when I saw him. He walked across the garden. Slow, barefoot, thin, pale skin. No shirt. He stopped at the back door and stood there for 20 minutes, not moving, just staring at the door. Then he turned and walked out of frame. He never looked at the camera. I called the police in the morning. They came and checked the footage. They took it seriously, to their credit. They patrolled for a couple nights, and I stayed at my brother's place. But they never caught anyone. After 2 weeks, they told me to keep the camera, stay vigilant, and report anything else. That was it. I moved a month later. Different city, different flat, different locks. I never went camping again. Nothing else happened after I moved. Not directly, but I still check my windows every night. I still bolt the doors, even if I'm just going to the shop. I still wake up sometimes thinking I heard a twig snap outside my window. I don't think he was just a wild camper. I don't think it was random. I think he followed me. I think he liked watching people who were alone. Quiet people. People who wouldn't be missed right away. People like me. And I think if I hadn't woken up that night to pee, if I hadn't looked across the stream, he might have come closer. He wasn't camping. He was hunting. And I was just lucky enough to see him first. My name's Thomas. I was 31 years old when this happened, and I've never really told anyone the full story. I don't think I ever will face to face either. It happened in 2018, mid-September. I was camping alone in the hills of Mid-Wales, near a place called Llyn Gwydir, a remote lake just off the grid, about an hour's hike from the nearest road. I'd been working in Cardiff at the time as a technician for a small telecoms company. I liked to head into the hills when I needed to get away from everything. I camped there before. The area was wild, with rolling hills, rough trails, and long stretches of pine and spruce woods. The kind of place where you can hear your own heartbeat at night.
No signals.
No people, just wind, grass, and the occasional sheep. I brought a good tent, food for 4 days, a portable stove, and an old .22 rifle I kept locked away at home, mainly for rabbits if I ever saw one. The day I arrived, everything felt normal. I parked my car about 3 miles away at the end of an unmarked logging road and hiked through shallow woods and open heath to reach the lake. It wasn't that big, just a quiet, dark pool surrounded by mossy banks and thick patches of trees. I set my tent up near the northern side where the ground sloped gently. There were old stones there, almost like a half-collapsed wall or ruins, but they were buried deep in the moss and hardly noticeable. The weather was mild, and the sky stayed overcast most of the afternoon. I remember cooking some sausages over the stove and watching the clouds roll in slow over the lake. Everything was calm. Nothing felt off. The only strange thing I noticed that first night was the quiet. Even in remote parts of Wales, you usually hear birds, insects, or wind in the branches. But as the sun went down, everything became completely silent. The air got cold and still.
No owls. No rustling.
Just this dead silence that settled around the camp like a thick blanket. I didn't think too much of it. I was used to quiet spots. I zipped up my tent, slid into the sleeping bag, and listened to the faint water lapping the edge of the lake. I slept through the night. The second day, I woke up around 6 a.m., stretched, brewed some instant coffee, and started hiking around the area. I didn't carry much, just the rifle, a bottle of water, and a map tucked in my coat pocket. The terrain around the lake was soft and uneven, covered in marshy patches, brambles, and thick grass. I hiked eastward along the tree-line, trying to trace where the stones led. It almost looked like there used to be some structure near the lake, maybe something very old. That's when I found the bones. They weren't buried, just sitting in a little hollow beneath a tree. Pile of them, long bones cracked open in places. At first I thought they were animal, deer maybe, but some of them looked off. There were smaller bones scattered in between the bigger ones, with one that looked a lot like a hand, and the oddest part was how clean they were.
No rot. No fur. No skin.
Just picked dry. I stood there looking down at them, not feeling scared, just thrown off. I'd been in the woods plenty of times. I'd seen dead foxes, half-eaten birds, even rotting badgers. This was different. Something had eaten them, something big, but I didn't see any teeth marks. Just these long scratches and snapped shafts like whatever had done it had opened the bones, not chewed them. I moved on, disturbed but trying to shake it off. I didn't want to overthink things. I told myself it was just a poacher's dumping ground or maybe some predator I didn't know much about. The rest of the day passed slowly. I returned to camp by late afternoon, boiled some noodles, and ate quietly beside the lake. That night I heard something. It started after midnight when I was half asleep. A rustling outside the tent. Not wind, not small animal noise. Something heavier. I stayed still, listening. The sound circled slowly, first on one side, then the other. I thought maybe a deer had wandered close, or maybe even a fox sniffing around my gear. I sat up and quietly unzipped the side of the tent just enough to peek out. There was something standing at the edge of the trees. At first I thought it was a person. It had the shape of one, tall, upright, still, but there was something wrong with the proportions. It was too thin, with arms that looked too long. The head was turned slightly, like it was looking toward the tent, but I couldn't see any details. Just this dark shape, not moving. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there, frozen, watching. It stayed there for maybe 2 minutes. Then it turned and walked off into the trees. Not rushed, just calmly, like it didn't care. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up early and moved the tent about 100 meters into a more open area. I told myself it was just some hiker, maybe someone else camping rough. But I'd been there 2 days and hadn't seen a single other person. No cars on the road. No signs of life. I was starting to feel watched. That third day, it rained off and on. I spent most of the day near the camp, chopping dry wood and trying to dry my socks by the fire. Late in the afternoon, I saw movement near the tree line again. This time I was sure it wasn't an animal. It was tall and it ducked behind a tree when I looked up. I grabbed the rifle and waited, heart pounding. Nothing moved for 10 minutes. Then I heard footsteps, faint, circling behind the brush. I didn't sleep that night either. Sometime past 3 a.m., I heard breathing near the tent. Not animal breathing, not the heavy huff of a deer or the sniff of a fox. It was slow, like human breathing, calm, steady. I stayed dead silent in my bag, clutching the rifle. Then I heard the zipper on the tent twitch. Not unzip, just twitch, like fingers were testing it. I slammed my hand against the side of the tent and shouted. I didn't say anything in particular, just a sound to scare whatever it was. The breathing stopped. There was a long pause, then the faint crunch of footsteps backing away into the grass. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped out with the rifle raised. There was no one there, but right at the edge of the grass, about 20 feet from the tent, I saw footprints. Bare feet, human, but the toes were long, too long, and they weren't even. The prints were off balance, like whoever made them was walking strange. There were drag marks, too, like the feet didn't lift all the way off the ground. That morning, I packed everything. I didn't even eat. I started hiking toward the car, keeping the rifle in my hand the whole way. The path back wound through a thick patch of spruce, dark and wet from the rain. That's when I heard it again, movement behind me. Light steps, then silence. Then steps again. Every time I stopped, it stopped too. Every time I turned around, I saw nothing. I walked faster. When I got to the clearing near the end of the path, I looked back one last time. It was there, standing between two trees, just watching. Its arms hung low, fingers almost touching the ground. The skin looked gray, like clay, and it had no clothes. Just this awful, stretched-out body. I raised the rifle and aimed, not thinking, just reacting. I fired one shot. It didn't flinch. It didn't even move. Turned and slipped behind the trees. I ran the last mile to the car, threw my gear in the boot, and drove down that logging road without stopping. The wheels kicked up gravel and mud, and I didn't care. I didn't breathe normally until I saw the lights of the nearest town 20 miles away. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I kept that promise. 3 weeks later, I looked up the area online. I found an old article from the early 90s about hikers going missing near that same lake. Nothing ever solved, just names on a list. The most recent one was from 2004. A man about my age. His pack was found, but not his body. They said it was a fall or maybe he got lost. But I remember the footprints. I remember the breathing. And I remember how that thing stood like it was learning how to be a man. I've camped in a dozen places since then, Scotland, Ireland, even in the Alps. But I've never gone back to Wales. And I never will. Whatever was in those woods near Elwyn Gwydir wasn't right. It wasn't just a man, and it wasn't just an animal. It was something in between, and it knew I saw it. I was 27 when it happened. I had just moved back to northern Wales after spending a few years working construction in the south. The job ended, and I needed a change of pace. So I went back home. My folks were gone by then, and I had no siblings. I was staying alone in a small rental cabin near Lanarhead-yr-Waiamaknant. Quiet place, hilly and green. Nothing much ever went on there. That's why I liked it. It was around early October 2017. The weather had cooled, the skies turned gray, and the leaves had started curling in at the edges. I was trying to get out more, keep my mind clear. I spent a lot of time walking. There was a trail not far from the cabin that cut through a thick patch of woods, and if you followed it for half a mile or so, you came to the old Bryn Coed Cemetery. It wasn't an active cemetery anymore. The church beside it had collapsed decades ago, and most of the graves were from the late 1800s or early 1900s. People said no one had been buried there since the 1940s. The stones were mossy and weather-worn, and some of them had tipped sideways into the soil. The entire place had this abandoned, heavy feeling to it, like time didn't move in there the way it did outside. I walked past it several times that week, and each time, I got the same uncomfortable tug in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but unease. I didn't believe in ghosts or any of that. I still don't. But that place had something to it. Something hard to explain. I chalked it up to overthinking. The woods were quiet. The gravestones were old. And I figured my imagination was filling in the blanks. Then, on a Thursday, I ran into a couple of guys at the corner shop. Locals, maybe in their mid-30s. One of them had seen me hiking, and he started asking if I'd been past Bryn Coed. I said I had. That kicked off a whole thing where they started joking about how no one went there after dark, how something was off about the place. They didn't come right out and say it was haunted or cursed or anything like that, but they danced around it. All I said was, I'd camp there without blinking, and they laughed, told me I wouldn't last a full night. I don't know if it was pride or boredom or just me being stubborn, but I told them I'd prove it, told them I'd sleep there that Friday night. I was expecting them to backpedal, maybe say it was just a joke, but they didn't. They just told me to be careful. That stuck with me more than anything else. Friday came, and the air was colder than it had been all week. I packed up my small one-man tent, sleeping bag, headlamp, some water, and a few protein bars. I left the cabin around 6 p.m. and walked out along the path through the woods. Took about 15 minutes to reach the graveyard. The trees on that trail were thick, so even before I arrived, the light was already dimming. When I got there, the cemetery looked exactly how I remembered. Lopsided gravestones, dead vines wrapped around them, and a metal fence that had fallen inward in a few places. The ground was uneven, soft in spots, with some of the graves sunken slightly, the way old ones do after a long time. There were no buildings, just the rotted wooden remains of the chapel at the far end. I didn't want to set up right on top of a grave, so I looked for a patch of grass between two headstones where the ground was level. Eventually, I found a small area in the middle of the cemetery where it seemed open enough. I laid the tent down and started setting up. By the time it was fully pitched, the sky had gone from pale blue to dark gray, and the first few stars were poking out through the clouds. That's when the silence hit me. Real silence. No birds, no whine through the trees, no insects. Just this heavy, blank quiet. The kind that makes your ears ring a little. I sat for a while outside the tent, leaned back against one of the gravestones, and watched the stars. I wasn't nervous then. It was cold, but manageable. Around 9:30, I crawled into the tent, zipped myself in, and tried to relax. I wasn't expecting to sleep much, just wanted to get through the night. That plan didn't last. Around midnight, I heard a crunching noise. It wasn't loud, but in that silence, it stood out, like footsteps in leaves. It came from behind the tent, a few meters away. My first thought was an animal, maybe a fox or a badger. I stayed still, didn't move. The noise stopped after a few seconds. Then came a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. I sat up fast and reached for the headlamp, flicked it on, and unzipped the tent flap. I stuck my head out, shined the light around. Nothing, just old stones and dead grass. No animals, no people, Nothing. I got out and did a quick circle of the tent. The light cut across the crooked lines of the gravestones. I even walked to the edge of the cemetery and looked through the gaps in the trees. Nothing moved. The silence was still there. I went back in the tent, zipped it shut, and laid down again, heart thumping a bit faster now. It was around 1:15 a.m. when I heard it again. But this time it wasn't footsteps or dragging. It was a metallic ping like something small hitting a rock. Then a faint scrape. Then a rustling noise. I grabbed the headlamp again and stepped out quickly, light sweeping the graves. Still no one. But now something was different. One of the stones, a smaller one near where I had set up, had tipped further than I remembered, like it had shifted. That's when I started to think someone might be messing with me. Maybe one of the guys from the shop had followed me out here. Maybe this was some prank. I called out once loudly, then waited. Nothing. I checked the area again, and eventually, after another 15 minutes, I went back into the tent. But sleep was off the table now. Every creak, every shift of wind, every snap of a twig made my stomach tighten. I kept my boots on and sat up in my sleeping bag, just waiting. At 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like breathing. It wasn't mine. I was holding mine. This was shallow, raspy. Close. I clicked on the headlamp and unzipped the tent. The light caught something brief, a flicker, something moving fast behind one of the larger stones about 10 feet away. I scrambled out, heart racing, and ran to that stone, swinging the beam of light side to side. There was nothing, but there were prints in the grass. Fresh ones. Not boots, bare feet. Wide, flat, and dirty. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I followed them about 4 meters before they just stopped. No turn, no retreat. Just ended. I backed up slowly, returned to the tent, and sat down hard. My whole body was wired. I didn't know if I was being watched or hunted or just losing my mind, but I knew I wasn't alone. I waited like that until first light. At dawn, I packed everything up in a rush. My hands were shaking, and the tent was damp from the dew. As I folded it up, I noticed something carved into the dirt near where my head had been while I slept. It wasn't deep, just dragged lines like someone had used a stick or nail. It was a single word: stay. I didn't. I grabbed my gear and left without looking back. I didn't stop until I was at the cabin, and I locked the door behind me, even though I hadn't locked it all week. I never went back to that trail. Not once. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. Not the locals, not even my closest friends. I didn't want to hear more theories, and I didn't want to be laughed at. I just left it behind. A few months later, I moved again, this time to the coast. But sometimes, when I lay in bed and everything is quiet, I think about those bare footprints. The kind that just stopped, like whoever made them wasn't walking at all. Just waiting, watching, breathing. And every time I do, I feel that same heavy silence settle over me again, like a curtain closing. I never camped alone after that. Not once. I had just turned 30 a few months before I drove up to North Dakota alone with my old camping gear. It was July 2016. I was living in Kansas at the time, working a warehouse job that paid well enough to keep me busy but left my head loud and tired every night. I had taken 2 weeks off, figuring I'd head north and away from everything for a while. I didn't have a solid plan, just a map, my gear, and the idea that I'd camp somewhere quiet and as far from people as possible. I wasn't trying to find anything special, just peace. I liked camping, but not at the usual packed campgrounds with kids screaming and radios blasting. I wanted the kind of trip where you could hear your own breathing at night and smell the damp moss in the air in the morning. I picked out a few remote Forest Service roads near the Theodore Roosevelt National Park on the western edge of the state. I found a long dirt road that curved deep into a wooded area just outside the park boundary. It wasn't on most tourist maps, but I'd seen a few references to dispersed camping being allowed there. It looked like it hadn't been maintained for years. That suited me just fine. I drove an old Ford Escape I'd bought used a year earlier. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had enough clearance to manage the rough roads. It rattled and coughed over every rock, but it got me about 5 miles off the main highway before the trees thickened and the road became more of a trail. The forest felt different up there. It was denser than I expected, with a wet, heavy silence that seemed to settle in the farther I went. At one point, I passed an old metal gate lying rusted and bent off to the side of the road. It was held up by one post, barely standing, and I had to nudge it out of the way to keep going. That should have been my sign. It had that abandoned look, like no one had passed that way in years. But I convinced myself it was fine. Just remote, that's all. That's what I came for, right? I found a clearing about 20 minutes after the gate. It was small and overgrown, with no signs of recent use, no fire rings, no tire tracks, no trash. There was an old tree stump near the center and a patch of dry, yellowing grass. The air smelled clean but strange, like rain that hadn't fallen yet. I set up camp quickly, working mostly by habit. Tent first, then the sleeping pad and bag. I kept a small cooler with basic food and a water jug in the back of the SUV. After everything was settled, I sat on the stump and just listened. There was nothing. No cars, no planes overhead, no people. Even the birds were quieter than usual. I didn't think much of it at the time. That first night went by fine. I made a small fire with some dead branches, sat with a paperback for an hour, then crawled into the tent and slept. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to pee, and I remember how still everything was. Not a single sound. I even held my breath at one point just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It was so quiet it started to feel wrong, but I shook it off. The next morning I walked a little. I didn't have a trail to follow, so I stuck close to camp, just exploring the woods. There were broken branches all over the place, some of them high up, like way higher than deer could reach. A few trees had long vertical scratches, like something sharp had been dragged down the bark. I told myself it was probably just storm damage or maybe elk, though I wasn't sure if elk even lived this far east. I found an old structure deeper in the woods about a half-mile out. It looked like it had once been a hunting cabin or maybe a storage shack. Just 4 walls and a roof. The door was missing, and half the roof had caved in. There were old metal cans, rusted to hell, and what looked like the frame of a bed inside. The weird part was a pile of bones off to one side. Not fresh, not bloody, just bones, white and brittle looking. Maybe deer, maybe not. I didn't hang around long. By the time I got back to my tent, something felt different. I noticed it before I saw anything. The air was warmer, but not like heat from the sun. More like body heat, like something had been moving around. My cooler was shifted a few inches. Not opened, just nudged. That might not sound like much, but I always lined my things up a certain way. I would have noticed if I moved it, and I hadn't. I started to feel like I wasn't alone out there. I didn't leave. I should have. But I told myself maybe a raccoon or something had nosed around while I was gone. No harm done. That night, I didn't light a fire. I wanted to stay quiet, low profile. I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling, listening. At around 11 p.m., I heard something step into the clearing. Not an animal, not a 4-legged shuffle. This was heavier, more deliberate. 2 feet. Someone walking. I stopped breathing for a second. My heart pounded so loud I felt it in my ears. I didn't move. My tent zipper was closed, and I kept still, hoping whatever it was would leave. Didn't. I heard footsteps circle halfway around the tent, then stop. I waited. A minute passed, then another, then nothing. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have passed out from exhaustion because I woke up at dawn, covered in sweat. I unzipped the tent and looked around. There were no footprints that I could see. The grass was trampled near the stump, though, and there was something on the tree beside my tent. A long, fresh scrape on the bark, as if someone had dragged a stick or blade across it during the night. I packed up fast that morning. I didn't even eat. I tossed everything into the SUV and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. But here's the part that stuck with me, the thing that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. When I drove back past that old gate, the one I had moved aside, it was standing straight up again. Not bent, not rusted through, like someone had fixed it, replaced it even. There were fresh tire tracks too. Not mine. Smaller, narrower, like a dirt bike or ATV. They came from the opposite direction and stopped right near where I had turned off. And right next to the gate, nailed into a tree I swore had nothing on it when I passed it the first time, was a small wooden board. It had words burned into it. Not for camping. Ever. Asterisk, asterisk, I didn't stop. I didn't take a picture. I just kept driving. I made it all the way down to Bismarck that day, booked a cheap hotel and slept with the lights on. I never went back to that part of the state again. I don't even camp alone anymore. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I wonder what would have happened if I had unzipped the tent. If I had looked, but I didn't. And I think that's the only reason I'm still around to tell this story. My name is Mark Fletcher. I was 38 when this happened. It was late October of 2017, and I had driven up from my home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to a small piece of public land near the South Dakota border, not far from a tiny town called Clearfield. I'd hunted out there a few times over the years. It wasn't a fancy place. No marked trails, no real campsites. Just open prairie rolling into brushy ridges and small pockets of trees. Good for mule deer and, if you were lucky, pheasant. I wanted to get away from people, and that place always gave me that. Just space, cold air, the sound of wind rattling dry grass. I had a week off work, and after my ex-wife and I finalized our divorce earlier that summer, I had no real obligations anymore. My daughter lived with her mom in Illinois. I figured I'd spend 5 or 6 days out there hunting alone, sleeping in my tent, cooking over a small campfire, and just getting my head clear. I packed light but efficient .270 Winchester, freeze-dried meals, a little gas burner, tarp, tent, water purifier, knife, compass, and maps. I kept things analog. My phone was there for emergencies, but service was spotty. I pulled my truck off a dirt access road about a mile south of the nearest ridge line. That first day, I set up my tent in a slight depression at the base of a slope. Good cover. I didn't want to be skylined at night. The ridge above was a good vantage point too. Lots of rocky outcroppings and brush where deer liked to bed. The wind was strong that evening, blowing out of the northwest, cutting and dry. I had to double stake my tent. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of fear, but just the way the wind pulled on the nylon and the cold found every little fold in my sleeping bag. Still, I woke up with the sun and made coffee on the burner, ate a granola bar, and started hiking east towards some trees I'd marked on the map. It was quiet out there, so quiet. You only really notice how much noise people make when you're in a place like that. The sound of your boots on dry grass becomes sharp. Your own breath starts to feel like it's echoing off hillsides. I didn't see anything that morning, but I wasn't in a rush. I glassed a few draws, found some sign. I was enjoying the silence. That second night, I cooked rice and beans, warmed by a low fire built from deadfall. Around 8 p.m., I noticed the temperature dropping quick, so I climbed into my sleeping bag early. I lay there staring up through the mesh of the tent at the stars, wind occasionally flapping the edges. It must have been around midnight when I first heard the snapping. It wasn't wind. This was sharp. One crack, then nothing. then another one, a short pause, then two in quick rhythm. It came from up the ridge. I sat up. My first thought was deer, maybe elk, though I hadn't seen any signs of them. Could have been coyotes. I zipped up my sleeping bag, threw on a jacket, and stepped outside barefoot onto the cold, dry grass. I listened. Nothing. Not a thing. Not even the wind. That stillness didn't sit right with me. In the prairie, even at night, there's always something. Cricket, a distant coyote yip, a hawk's wings stirring the grass. But now it was as if someone had shut a door on the entire world. I stood there a minute, then went back inside. Wrote it off as a tree branch breaking somewhere up the ridge. I was half asleep when it started again. Closer this time. Crunching. Not fast. Just a steady pattern, slow and deliberate, coming downslope through the brush. I grabbed my rifle and sat up against the wall of the tent, heart going faster now. I didn't move, just sat and listened. The crunching stopped about 30 feet from where my tent was. Then nothing again. Long, terrible silence. I don't know how long I stayed awake. Eventually I must have passed out, because I woke up with the sun pouring in and my back aching from the awkward position. There were no tracks when I stepped out, no obvious signs. I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe wind carrying sounds strange. I spent the next day further east, over a shallow ridge where the trees thickened and the ground got soft. Still no luck hunting, but I didn't really care anymore. Something had changed in my mind since the night before. I got back to camp before dark, sat on a log and ate cold beans. I didn't build a fire, didn't want to advertise myself. I barely slept. That night the air was dead still again. No wind.
No bugs. No rustling.
I kept the rifle close and listened. Nothing came. But the next morning I found something that made my gut twist. About 20 yards upslope from my tent, I saw a long, narrow footprint in the dust. Just one. Not boot tread. Barefoot. The toes were spread wide, the heel deep. Too big to be mine. I looked around in every direction for more, but that was the only one I could find. Just one perfect imprint, like whoever or whatever left it had been standing still, watching. I told myself it could have been old. Maybe I missed it earlier. Maybe it was a weird animal print distorted by erosion. But deep down I didn't believe that. It looked fresh. The edges were sharp. No dew settled in it. That day I packed my bag and took it with me while hiking. I didn't want to leave anything behind if I had to bail in a hurry. By late afternoon, I was up near the ridge itself, scanning with binoculars when I saw movement. Something slipped between two trees down in a shaded draw. I focused in, but it was gone. I moved slowly, circled around, and came downwind, trying to see if it had been a deer. But I found nothing. No tracks.
No scent.
Nothing broken or disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. I got back to camp and sat on the ground, leaning against my pack with the rifle across my lap. The sky turned orange, then deep blue, and the air got cold fast. That night, the sounds came back. Not crunching this time, just a low, dragging shuffle. Something moving in a wide arc around the tent, maybe 30 or 40 feet out, pausing every so often. I didn't go outside. I didn't make a sound. Just sat there in the dark with the safety off. At one point, I could hear it breathing. Not heavy, just slow and wet, like someone with a congested chest. It was close, so close. Then I heard the zipper. Not mine. Somewhere to the left of the tent, I heard a short, high-pitched zip, like the sound of a jacket being undone. But it wasn't windy. There were no people. No one hikes out there that time of year. And I didn't own anything that made that exact sound. My body felt paralyzed. I could hear my pulse hammering in my neck. I didn't move, not for hours. I just sat there until dawn crept across the dry ridgeline. When I finally stepped outside, I saw it. On the side of my tent, about waist high, was a long slice through the nylon. Clean, about 6 inches long, like it had been done with a knife. That was it for me. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't care about garbage. I shoved it all into my pack and walked out.
No brax.
Rifle in one hand, bag on my back. I reached the truck by noon, but that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, at home, I was unpacking everything and noticed my sleeping bag was inside out. I hadn't done that, and it was zipped all the way up from the inside. That detail nearly made me puke, because I remembered clearly, when I left camp that morning, I had folded it loosely and shoved it in the bottom of the pack without zipping it at all. Something had unrolled it, crawled inside, then zipped it up. I haven't camped since. I still hunt, but I stick to public blinds or go with friends now. Never alone, never near Clearfield. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't a ghost. It was real, flesh and blood. And it watched me for 3 nights, moving slow, waiting. And the worst part? I think it wanted me to leave, because if it wanted something else, I wouldn't be here writing this. My name's Jacob Morris. This happened to me in the autumn of 2018. I was 32 back then, living in Derbyshire, England. I'd been working in construction for over a decade, and after a long stretch of back-to-back jobs, I had a few weeks off. I didn't want to spend it lying around or drinking at the local pub like most of my mates. I needed real quiet, somewhere out in the woods with no phone signal, no traffic noise, and no one bothering me. That's how I ended up planning a solo hunting and camping trip in a place I didn't know too well. There was a spot my uncle had taken me to once, years ago, in Northumberland, near a place called Kielder Forest. It was huge, rolling hills, thick woods, a lot of it untouched and empty. He used to say if you walked far enough in, you could go all day without seeing another person. That's exactly what I was looking for. I packed light but enough to get me through 5 or 6 days. Sleeping bag, tarp, food, water purifier, gas stove, ammo, and my old .308 rifle. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Just left a note with my sister in case something went wrong. Not that I thought it would. I drove out early one morning and parked at a remote trailhead I'd found on a map. There weren't even proper signs, just a lay-by and a thin track going into the trees. I locked up the car, shouldered my pack, and walked in. The first day was calm, quiet, exactly what I needed. I hiked for hours, deeper into the forest, past mossy rocks and old pine stumps, until I reached a small valley near a creek. The air smelled clean pine, wet soil, fallen leaves. No sound except the wind in the branches and the water running nearby. I pitched my tarp between 2 trees and made camp just before sunset. That night, I sat by the fire, ate some boiled rice and beans, and just listened. There were owls calling, the occasional rustle from a deer or badger, but nothing out of the ordinary. I felt safe. I slept well. The second day, I started hunting. I wasn't out for trophies, just something small like a roe deer or maybe a hare. I tracked quietly through the woods, checking old game trails. Found a few signs. Fresh droppings, some scuffed earth, and even a hoof print in the soft mud near a stream. I followed the trail uphill, away from camp, but didn't see anything worth shooting. That was fine. I had time. When I came back to camp later, I noticed something strange. My tarp looked off. One side was slightly sagging, and a corner peg had been pulled out. At first, I figured it was just the wind or maybe a curious animal, but the ground nearby didn't have any of the usual signs. No paw prints, no claw marks, nothing. Just the peg yanked out and a small scrape across the dirt near where my stove had been. I put it back and tightened the ropes. Probably nothing. Still, I kept my rifle closer that night. On the third day, I woke up to a faint noise. It was still dark, maybe 5:30 in the morning. I could hear light movement outside the tarp, leaves brushing against something. It wasn't fast or panicked like an animal. It was slow, careful. I didn't move. I just lay there, breathing through my nose, one hand on the rifle beside me. The sound circled halfway around my shelter and then stopped. Nothing for 5 minutes, then 10. Eventually, I built up the nerve to unzip the tarp and peek out. There was nothing there, just the gray light of morning starting to come in through the trees, fog hanging low over the forest floor. I stepped out slowly, boots crunching on the cold grass. I looked around, no movement, no sound. I walked a few meters out and saw something odd in the soil, a partial footprint. Not a boot, a trainer. Someone else had been out here. It wasn't recent, maybe from the day before, but it hadn't been there when I set up camp. I was sure of it. I stared at the print for a while, trying to decide if I was overreacting. It was possible a hiker had come through and left it. Still, it felt off. The direction it was facing pointed straight at my camp. That day, I stayed closer to the area and kept checking my surroundings. No signs of people, no more prints. Around noon, I spotted a young roe deer on a ridge about 200 meters away. I lined up the shot, fired, and dropped it clean. I gutted it right there and packed the meat in a cloth sack I'd brought. The rest I buried, following the usual precautions. When I got back to camp, everything was where I left it. I cooked a bit of the meat and dried the rest for later. I tried to ignore the unease crawling up my back. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing small sounds. Not loud, but enough to keep waking me. Twigs snapping, leaves shifting. Then, sometime deep in the night, I heard what I knew wasn't an animal. It was a metallic clink, like something brushing against my stove. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. I didn't want to shine my torch and give away my exact spot. After maybe a minute, I crept out with the rifle and scanned the area. Again, no one. Nothing moved. But my stove had shifted a few inches from where I'd left it. The wind couldn't have done that. The fourth day, I broke camp early and moved a few kilometers away. I didn't want to run into whoever it was. I hiked north, following the stream, and set up in a new spot under a thick cluster of trees. Felt more hidden. I camouflaged the tarp better this time, scattered leaves over anything reflective. I kept all my gear tight and close. I didn't want anything left lying around. Around mid-afternoon, I found another deer trail and followed it up into a small clearing. No deer, but I saw something that stopped me cold. In the center of the clearing, near a mossy log, was a tree with a branch snapped off about 6 feet up. Tied around the stub was a piece of twine, and dangling from it was a set of 3 rabbit feet, dried and knotted together. It wasn't a hunter's trap or some bushcraft thing. It looked like a marker. I walked around the tree carefully. Nearby were more rabbit bones, some charred like they'd been cooked, and what looked like the ashes of a very small fire, cold and dead. Someone else had camped here, and it wasn't recent. Maybe a few days, maybe a week. That night, I barely slept at all. I kept the rifle across my chest, my back against a tree. I didn't cook anything, didn't light a fire, just chewed on cold food and waited for daylight. On the 5th morning, I heard something while packing up. Distant but clear, a single gunshot. Not close, but not far enough either. Maybe a mile off. Could have been a hunter, sure, but it didn't feel right. The forest had been dead silent all morning, and then that one shot. I didn't wait around. I stuffed everything in my bag and moved out, this time heading east, back toward where I thought the road might be. I didn't care about the meat, the gear, I just wanted out. The forest felt different now. Not just quiet, but heavy, like it was watching. I kept checking behind me, ears straining for anything. I saw no one, heard nothing, but I never stopped looking. By the 6th day, I was rationing the last of my water and energy bars. My sense of direction was fraying. I hadn't seen a trail in 2 days. My phone was useless. The battery had died back on the third night, and there hadn't been signal since I walked in. Then I saw something that nearly made me sit down in shock. It was a can of beans, sitting on a flat rock near a bend in the creek. Not old and rusted, new, clean, unopened, placed there deliberately. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, then slowly backed away. I hiked for another hour, pushing through thick brush, and came across something else. Another tarp. This one was green, low to the ground, half collapsed like it had been abandoned fast. There were crushed leaves around it, no gear inside. Just the faint smell of smoke and something else. Something like sweat and old clothes. I didn't stay. I moved fast, heart thudding like it was going to tear out of my chest. That night, I didn't set up camp. I just huddled under a tree, shaking and listening. I thought about yelling for help, but I knew how far out I was. No one would hear. If someone was stalking me, yelling would only make things worse. The next morning, I found the trail. I don't know how. Maybe I'd looped back, or maybe I was just lucky. But it was a narrow track, barely there, leading downhill. I followed it for hours. My legs ached, my mouth was dry, but I didn't stop. Late that afternoon, I saw the car. My red hatchback was still there, parked under a thin line of trees. I staggered toward it, dropped my pack, and checked the doors. Still locked. I got in, started the engine, and just sat there for a while, breathing. Then I noticed the note on the windshield. It was under the wiper, folded once, no envelope. I reached out with shaking fingers and opened it. It said, in neat, blocky handwriting, "You're lucky." That was it. No name, no explanation, just those 2 words. I didn't sleep when I got home. I didn't unpack for days. I kept the note in a drawer, not because I wanted to remember it, but because part of me still can't believe it really happened. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone followed me through the woods for days without showing themselves? I haven't been hunting since, and I sure as hell never went back to Kielder. I was 36 years old when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Peak District. It was late September of 2014, a time of year when the air started to cool down just enough that mornings came with mist clinging to the hills and evenings turned cold fast. I had time off work, no one to really answer to, and a quiet craving for stillness. I needed to get away from noise, from screens, from people. I'd always found peace in the hills, the wind in the grass, and the long dirt paths that seemed to stretch into nowhere. I picked a small area near Hope Valley, not too remote, but far enough off the usual tourist routes that I figured I'd have at least a couple days of quiet. I wasn't trying to push my limits or prove anything. I just wanted some space. I packed light, one-man tent, gas burner, simple food, knife, rain gear, some basic navigation tools.
No fancy satellite gear.
I didn't even bring a phone charger because I planned to shut it off the moment I pitched camp. The drive out was simple. I left Sheffield in the morning and was parked at a small gravel levee by early afternoon. There were no signs, no other cars, nothing around but moorland, trees, and the faint sound of wind cutting through. I followed an old path into the woods, rough but still visible. I must have walked for an hour and a half, steadily climbing uphill, until I found a little clearing surrounded by silver birch trees. Soft grass, flat enough for my tent. Felt right. I set up camp just before the sun began to dip. The woods were quiet, too quiet in a way that made you aware of your own movements. I remember the sharp sound of the tent poles clicking together, the dull snap of twigs under my boots, the whisper of wind in the birch leaves. That night was uneventful. I cooked some rice and beans, sat on a folded mat, and just listened to the world. When it got dark enough that I couldn't see my hand without the headlamp, I crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off. The cold woke me a few times, and once I thought I heard a fox barking in the distance, but nothing strange, just the usual country sounds. The second day, I hiked a bit further inland. I didn't bring a map. I had the trail in my head and I wasn't going far. I spent most of the afternoon walking under a cloudy sky, the sort of overcast that feels like it might rain but never does. I saw some deer scat, some rabbit holes, but nothing big. I didn't see a single person. That was fine by me. I wanted quiet. I returned to camp just before dusk and noticed something that made my skin tighten. My tent flap was undone. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't zipped it fully. The wind could have tugged it loose, but I always double-check things like that. Still, it didn't look tampered with. Nothing missing. Food was sealed, gear untouched. Could have been nothing. I zipped it tight and sat down to boil water for tea, but I couldn't shake it. That tiny feeling of something being just slightly off. That night, the wind picked up. My tent flapped a little, and I lay in my bag listening. At around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard something. Not wind, not an animal. A soft crunch, like footsteps in leaves. Close, not right outside, but close. I froze. Every part of my body stiffened. I waited, heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. The sound stopped after maybe 10 seconds. Silence again. Too much silence. Eventually, I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer. I waited another hour before I could fall back asleep. The next morning, everything looked the same. Nothing moved. Nothing missing. But the ground outside my tent looked pressed, like someone had stepped there and disturbed the wet layer of leaves. I stood looking at it for a long time, telling myself it could have been mine. But the angle was wrong. I hadn't stepped there. I packed my day bag and hiked further west, but I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't enjoy the walk like I had before. Every sound had weight now. Every bird call, every rustle in the undergrowth made my skin crawl. I kept thinking of those footprints and that crunching sound. The thought that someone might be watching crept in and wouldn't leave. When I returned late afternoon, my gut dropped again. My fire pit looked different. Nothing dramatic, just the stones were shifted slightly. One of the charred logs was gone. Just one. The others were still there. I walked in circles around my camp, checking everything. Tent untouched, pack in place, food sealed. But I didn't feel alone. I had that deep, crawling instinct like being watched from behind a curtain. I didn't light a fire that night. I ate cold bread and sausage and sat in silence with my back against a tree, facing the dark woods. Sometime after midnight, I saw something. I didn't hear anything first. I just felt it, the pressure of being observed. I looked out through a gap in the trees toward the darker part of the woods downhill, and I saw a man, or the shape of one, still, not moving, standing maybe 20 yards from the edge of my clearing. He was tall, wearing something dark. I couldn't see his face, just a figure standing between two trees. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched, and he didn't move either. He just stood. For how long, I don't know. Maybe a minute, maybe 10. Eventually, I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my things while it was still dark, snuffed every trace of my camp, and moved deeper into the woods before sunrise. I didn't want him to know I was leaving. I walked hard and fast for hours, heading south toward a road I remembered from past hikes. I didn't stop to eat. My legs burned. My back hurt. I didn't care. I just wanted to be where there were people. But the woods are thick out there, and I must have misjudged my route. The path I thought would take me out just circled back. When I realized I'd looped back near where I started, panic hit me. I dropped my pack and dry heaved in the underbrush. My mouth tasted like metal. I forced myself to calm down and got the compass out. Reoriented. Took a long way around. found a dry stream bed and followed it downhill, hoping it would lead to some kind of road or path. That's when I saw something hanging from a tree. It was one of my socks. My red wool hiking sock, tied by the toe from a branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. I hadn't lost it. It had been in my bag. I dropped everything and just stood there staring at it. That's when I heard the crunch again. Behind me, closer than before. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran like I hadn't run in years. My knees screamed. My lungs burned. I didn't care. I crashed through undergrowth, took brambles to the face, stumbled into a thorn bush and kept running. I lost my direction, my bearings, everything. But I kept going until I saw a low stone wall and vaulted over it into a sheep field. I kept running until I found a tractor path and followed it, half limping, all the way to a farmer's shed. That was the first person I'd seen in 3 days. He looked at me like I'd crawled out of a ditch, and I probably looked like I had. Mud-covered, panting, pale, bleeding from one arm where a branch had cut me. I didn't explain much. I just asked for the nearest town and walked the road until I found a pub with a taxi number pinned to the door. I didn't call the police. What was I going to say? I didn't know who the man was. I didn't know what he wanted. I had no name, no proof. Just a sick feeling that if I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't have walked out. I went home and didn't talk about it. I showered for almost an hour. I shaved. I cleaned the cuts. I put the gear away. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Some local playing a prank. Someone hiking through. But then I remembered the sock, the fire pit, the footprints, the man. I didn't sleep right for months after that. I'd wake up and check the locks. I couldn't walk through woods without my stomach flipping. The peace I used to feel out there was gone. Ruined. That was 10 years ago now. I still hike sometimes. Short trails, nothing deep. Never alone. Never without a phone. And I never, ever go back to the Peak District. Not because I think he's still out there, but because some part of me knows I was never supposed to see him. And the only reason I made it out was because I left before he was ready. It was late September 2012. I was 32 at the time, living in a small rented apartment in Birmingham, England, and dealing with the kind of burnout you don't realize is building up until it spills over. I worked long hours in a commercial plumbing business, mostly stuck inside concrete skeletons of buildings under construction, breathing in dust and arguing with site managers. I was in decent shape, but mentally I was fried. I had no kids, no partner at the time, and not much tying me to the city beyond bills and habit. So I decided to take a short solo camping trip. Nothing fancy, just me, a tent, and 2 days off. I figured a change of pace would help clear my head, give me room to think. I didn't want a busy caravan site or a national park crawling with people. I wanted quiet, real quiet. So I picked a spot I'd read about years before but had never been to, somewhere in the Forest of Dean. A small, unofficial clearing by a slow-moving river a few miles off the main trails. It wasn't on any modern maps, just something I remembered reading in an old hiking forum. People said it was hard to find, but peaceful once you got there. I packed up my old Nissan with basic supplies. Just enough food for a couple of days, a canteen, a water filter, tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, knife, first aid kit, tarp, and a few essentials. I left early Friday morning, driving for hours through winding rural roads. The last stretch was rough. No real path, just gravel and dirt. I had to park the car in a small levee and hike the rest of the way in. Maybe an hour and a half through patchy woodland, using a printed satellite image I'd marked up with guesses. By the time I found the river and the clearing next to it, the sun was already starting to dip. The place was perfect, quiet. The river moved slowly, almost like glass. Trees lined both banks, close enough to shade everything in a deep green hue. I set up my tent just out of sight of the water and cleared a small space for a fire. There were no trails nearby, no noise except the wind and the occasional rustle of birds in the canopy. Exactly what I needed. That first night, I made a small fire, heated a tin of beans, and sat beside the river for what felt like hours. It was cold, but not unbearably so, and I had packed extra layers. I slept surprisingly well. The next day, I woke early and walked along the riverbank, heading upstream with no real plan, just breathing the air and enjoying the absence of concrete, steel, and voices. I found tracks here and there, deer, maybe fox, but no people. I cooked around midday, read a bit in my tent, then stretched out on a tarp and watched the trees move overhead. By evening, I was already dreading going back to normal life, but something shifted that night. A small feeling really, started when I saw the lights. Around 9 p.m., I was sitting near the fire again, watching the flames burn down. I had the flashlight with me, but I didn't need it yet. The moon was out, low and yellow behind the trees. I remember looking up, and between the branches, I noticed something strange in the distance. Not in the sky, on the ground. Lights. At first, I thought they might be campers, but these weren't the kind of warm, steady glows you get from tents or campfires. They looked more like flashlights or headlamps, but the movement was odd, too fast, jerky. I saw one, then two more. Small specks of white shifting in the woods across the river, maybe 150 meters away. Then they disappeared behind the trees. I told myself it was probably just hikers, maybe kids messing around. But I'd walked all around that area earlier and hadn't seen any sign of people.
No footprints. No camps.
Nothing. Still, I tried not to let it bother me. I doused the fire, went into the tent, zipped everything up, and listened. For a while, there was nothing, just the wind in the branches. But then I heard something that made my skin go cold. It was faint. I couldn't place it at first. Not talking, not footsteps, just a metallic sound, a clinking, like something being tapped lightly against metal. Not constant, every few seconds. I held my breath and sat up, straining to hear. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, there was no sign of anything unusual. I walked to the riverbank and scanned the opposite side. Nothing. No boot prints, no gear, no movement. I convinced myself it had just been distant lights, maybe a group passing through. I started to feel stupid for being so on edge. But something was different now. Couldn't settle. I didn't want to pack up and leave, not yet, but I didn't want to walk far from camp either. So I stayed close, rechecking my gear, gathering more firewood, filtering water from the river, trying to distract myself. Around 4 p.m., I spotted something across the water. A figure. It was too far to see clearly, but it was definitely a person. Standing still, just beyond a tree, facing my side of the river. I froze. They didn't move, just stood there, maybe watching, then slowly stepped back into the trees. I didn't go after them. I didn't yell. I just crouched there, breathing hard. The woods were still again, but every part of my body felt wrong, like something had tilted out of place. I packed my things slowly. I didn't want to make it obvious. I rolled up the sleeping bag and took down the tent, but left the firewood stacked like I was staying. I kept one bag packed with food and clothes, but left the backpack zipped shut like normal. I wanted whoever or whatever was out there to think I was staying one more night. I moved my packed gear just behind the tree line, near a group of thick roots and mossy rocks. It gave me a partial view of the camp, but kept me hidden. I waited there as the sun dropped. Around 8 p.m., I saw the lights again. This time there were 4 of them, moving across the river, coming closer, not in a straight line, more like a slow arc, as if they were circling. Every now and then, one would stop, then flicker and vanish only to reappear again in a different spot. They didn't cross the water, but they were watching the campsite, watching my tent. I stayed perfectly still behind the roots. I don't know how long it lasted. The lights blinked out one by one. Maybe an hour passed, then silence. Then I heard the metal sound again, closer now. A soft clink, clink, clink. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I grabbed my things and left everything else behind. Tent poles, the tarp, extra food. I hiked hard, barely stopping, checking over my shoulder the whole way. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. Every sound made me jump. A bird, a squirrel, a branch shifting. It all felt wrong. I got back to the car just before noon. Nothing was touched. I started it up and drove straight home without stopping. For weeks after that, I kept thinking about those lights, about that figure by the tree, about the sound of metal. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online, went back to that old forum thread, and tried to find the place again. The thread was gone. No cached version, no archives, just dead links. I looked up incidents in the area, missing persons, police reports, found nothing concrete. Just one article from 2007. A paragraph buried in a local paper about hikers finding a crude campsite full of animal bones and handmade tools near the same forest.
No arrests. No suspects.
No follow-up. I've never been back. I still hike sometimes, but never alone. Never anywhere without marked trails and cell service. And every time I see someone standing too still in the woods, I think of that shape across the river and wonder how long it watched me before I saw it. I should have left when I saw the lights, but I didn't, and I'll never forget that sound. Clink, clink, clink. It was in late October of 2013, and I was 35 back then. I'd been working in construction nonstop for over 8 months, and the noise, the deadlines, and the constant hammering had started to crawl under my skin. I needed to get away, just for a weekend. I didn't want a beach, I didn't want crowds. I wanted silence, solitude, maybe some cold wind through the trees. So I drove north into Scotland and parked my car near the edge of a logging road a few miles past the village of Canich. That place, Glen Affric, has always had a pull on me. It's thick with forest, and there's a quiet that settles over it when the clouds drop low that I've never quite found anywhere else. I packed light, just my green rucksack, a one-man tent, a sleeping bag, and some dried food. I brought a small burner, a headlamp, my old knife, and a waterproof jacket I trusted. I hadn't brought a phone. I didn't want it buzzing. I didn't even want the option to check the time. Just the woods and the sound of my boots pressing into the mud. It was cloudy when I set off, late in the morning, and the sun had only peeked through a few times as I hiked deeper into the forest. The trees were mostly pine and birch, a mix of yellow leaves and sharp green needles. The air was cold and wet-smelling. After about 4 hours of walking, I found a patch of ground by a narrow stream that looked flat enough to camp on. There was a steep hill on one side, and the woods opened just enough to let the light through. I set up the tent, boiled water, and made some instant noodles. I sat on a rock, warm bowl in my hands, watching the stream gurgle over mossy stones. That first night passed without anything strange. I remember sleeping well, even though the wind picked up sometime after midnight and rattled the fly sheet. I woke around 8 a.m. to gray skies and the smell of damp earth. My boots were cold and my jacket still smelled of smoke from the small fire I'd built the night before. The next day, I wandered farther from camp with my knife in my belt and a bottle of water in my jacket. The forest was thick, and the trails weren't marked, so I tied strips of red cloth to some of the trees every 50 yards to find my way back. It rained lightly around noon, but only for an hour. The woods had this deep hush to them that day.
No birds.
No movement, just wind through trees and my boots crunching wet undergrowth. I followed deer tracks for a while but lost them near a patch of heather. I turned back before the light started to fade. I didn't want to rely on the headlamp. That evening I ate jerky and some hard biscuits. My lighter was damp, so I didn't bother with a fire. I crawled into the tent early, around 6 p.m., and listened to the rain start again. Soft at first, then stronger. The tent flapped and shifted with the gusts. I felt at ease, though. That sound, the rain on nylon, has always helped me sleep. It was sometime past midnight when I woke up. I didn't sit up right away. I opened my eyes slowly. The rain had stopped. The wind had died, too. It was dead quiet, and that's what pulled me out of sleep. That silence. It wasn't natural. Not in those woods. There's always something. A distant owl, a branch creaking, the stream. But this was flat silence, like someone had dropped a blanket over the world. I stayed still. My ears adjusted, and I strained them. Nothing. I figured maybe the weather had just stilled everything. I unzipped the sleeping bag a little. The tent felt warm and dry, but the air outside smelled sharp, like mud and wet bark. Then I heard it, a stick snapping. Not loud, not close, but not far either. Maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tent. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. I stayed still. Another snap, then a soft crunch. Leaves or twigs under something heavy. It stopped. A pause. Then another slow step. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't have a gun. My knife was in the side pouch of the tent. I quietly, as slowly as I could, slid my hand over and unzipped the pouch. My fingers found the cold grip and I pulled it close to my chest. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I could feel it in my throat. More steps, still slow, closer now. Then silence again. I waited. 10 seconds, maybe 20. Nothing. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Out there. It was soft, but just loud enough to make the hair on my arms rise. Someone or something was standing just outside the trees watching the tent. I thought maybe it was a lost hiker, but it was nearly 1 a.m. now. What hiker walks around in pitch dark, in a remote forest, during rain? My light was off. My fire was out. My tent was the same dull brown as the forest floor. You'd have to know exactly where I was to find it in that blackness. Unless they'd followed me. I slowly reached up and unzipped the top corner of the tent. Just a sliver. I peeked out. Pitch black.
No moon.
Just a few faint shadows from the trees. But I saw movement, just for a second. A shape between two trees. Tall, still, facing me. I closed the zipper again and held my breath. I didn't sleep. I lay there gripping the knife until my hand cramped. I didn't move. I listened. Eventually, I heard steps again, this time moving away. Slow, then faster, then fading. I waited another half hour, maybe longer, before I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and wet. I turned on my headlamp and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. I circled the tent. No tracks, but the ground was wet and soft. Any footprints might have been washed out by the earlier rain. I went back inside and stayed up until the gray light of morning started to seep through the trees. When I finally stepped out again, the forest looked normal. Birds were calling. The stream bubbled like always, but I packed up. Fast. I knew I hadn't imagined it. There had been someone there, watching. I could feel it in my gut. I thought about leaving, hiking straight back to the car. But something in me didn't want to let whoever that was push me out. I'd camped before all over Scotland, even some parts of Norway. I'd never had anything like that happen. So I decided I'd move camp. A few miles in a new direction. Maybe closer to the road, but not so close that I'd be seen from it. I hiked hard for the next 4 hours, heading east. I didn't take breaks. I kept checking behind me. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but I kept looking. By late afternoon, I found another spot. It was on a small rise with thicker trees around. Not as open as before, but that felt safer, less exposed. I pitched the tent fast, found a few dry branches under a pine tree, and got a fire going. I even cooked some canned stew I'd packed for emergencies. Felt good to eat something hot. The rain started again around sunset, heavier this time, thick drops pounding the tent roof. I sat inside with the knife close. I didn't sleep much. Every noise made me sit up. Every gust made me flinch. But nothing happened that night. I thought maybe it had just been a passing wanderer. Maybe some old local. Maybe he saw my camp and got curious. Creeped me out, sure, but maybe not dangerous. By the third day, I started to relax a little. I walked a bit in the morning. Not far, just near the ridge. I saw deer again, heard a woodpecker. The forest felt alive again. I told myself the first camp had just been in a bad spot. Maybe near someone's hidden cabin or old hunting route. The sky stayed gray all afternoon. I spent most of the day gathering firewood, keeping things dry, boiling more water, cleaning out my pot. The normal things. But by late evening, the air started to shift. That kind of quiet came back. Not as strong as the first night, but enough to notice. The birds stopped again. No wind, just the patter of rain starting up. I ate quickly, stuffed my gear into the dry bags, and zipped myself into the tent. Around midnight, I heard something again. A soft scrape, then another. It wasn't walking this time. It was slower, dragging. Then it stopped. I sat there holding the knife, staring at the tent wall. Then came the breathing, same as before, only this time it was right outside the tent. Heavy, bit, like someone was trying to stay quiet but couldn't help the sound. Then I saw it, a shadow. Someone walked around the tent, slow, deliberate.
No flashlight, no noise.
Just that shape. I didn't move. Then came the sound of fabric, the sound of a finger or a knife dragging slowly along the side of the tent. It scraped all the way around, not cutting, just touching. Then it stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. The breathing got closer again. Then silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then the steps moved off. Faster this time. Then gone. I didn't move for over an hour. Then I crawled out and lit the fire again. I didn't sleep at all. I packed everything the moment daylight hit the trees. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I just hiked, fast and straight, following my map and compass until I reached the road. My car was untouched. I didn't look back. I got in, soaked and muddy, and drove for hours without stopping. I didn't even listen to the radio. A week later, when I'd gotten back to my flat in Birmingham, I went through my gear. Everything was wet and smelled like pine. But when I checked the tent carefully, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small cut on the back panel, about 6 inches long. Clean, straight, a blade. It hadn't gone through the mesh, so I didn't notice it from inside. But it was fresh. Someone had tried to cut into the tent while I was inside. Not just watch me, not just scare me. They'd tried to come in. I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again. It was 2016 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Arizona. I was 29 at the time, living in Phoenix, working a job that was slowly grinding me down. The city was loud, hot, and busy. I needed a break from all of it. I wanted trees, silence, fresh air. I had camped a few times before with friends, but this time I wanted to do it alone, off-grid, out of cell service. I figured it would clear my head. I I chose a spot just outside of a town called Williams, not too far from Kaibab National Forest. I had done some research and found a Forest Service road that went deep into the woods with no official campsites, just random clearings people had used before. I drove out on a Friday morning early. My truck was packed with supplies, tent, food, water, a small propane stove, firewood, and my rifle. I always brought it more for peace of mind than anything else. The road into the forest was rough, narrow, with deep ruts. I followed it for about an hour, seeing no other cars. Every mile I drove, the trees got thicker and the feeling of being truly alone grew. Eventually, I found a small clearing on a slope that looked out over a thick pine valley. No signs of recent use. I parked the truck and walked around to be sure. Felt right. I set up my tent about 30 yards from the truck, just beyond a few clusters of rocks. From there, I had a clear view down the hill. It was quiet. No sounds except wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of birds. I got a small fire going and made coffee. It was the most peaceful I had felt in years. That first day was calm. I walked a bit, checked the area for water sources, but mostly sat around reading and relaxing. By the time night fell, I was exhausted and went to bed early. I had a flashlight and my rifle within arm's reach in the tent, just in case. There were the usual night sounds: branches creaking, something moving through brush far away, but nothing strange. On the second day, I woke early and decided to hike down the hill into the valley. It looked shallow from the top, but it was deeper than I expected. I made it down in about an hour, marking trees along the way so I wouldn't get lost. There were signs of old animal paths, maybe deer or elk. I didn't see any fresh tracks though. Down in the valley, the trees were packed tight. Less light came through the canopy. I found a dry creek bed and followed it east for a while. The place was beautiful but quiet in a strange way. It felt like a place people didn't go often. After a couple hours, I turned back and made it back to camp by afternoon. That night, something felt off. It started just after sunset. The woods got too quiet.
No bugs, no rustling.
Even the wind had died. I sat by the fire with a strange tightness in my chest. I kept telling myself it was just isolation playing with my nerves, but something in my gut kept twisting. Around 11 p.m., I heard movement. Not the kind animals make, it was rhythmic, heavy. Came from down the hill. I killed the fire and crouched low, straining to listen. The sounds were slow footsteps on pine needles, breaking twigs every few steps. It wasn't charging, just moving, steady. I waited, rifle in hand. After 5 minutes, the sound stopped. Nothing. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, then finally crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, not turning on any light. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, eyes wide open, every little sound pulling my nerves tighter. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I looked around the camp. No signs of anything. No tracks, no damage. I told myself it was probably a deer or elk wandering by, but I had heard deer before. This wasn't that. I should have left that morning, but I had convinced myself it was nothing. I didn't want to look like a coward to myself. I spent the day staying close to camp, cutting firewood, keeping busy. I had a radio, no signal. I walked a little but didn't go far. That evening, I got the fire going again, cooked a bit of food, and tried to enjoy the last night of the trip. The woods stayed quiet. No wind, no birds, just silence. By 9 p.m., the fire had died down and I sat in the dark, just listening. That's when I heard it again. This time it came from the right side of the clearing. Slow, spaced footsteps. Then they stopped. A full 10 minutes passed with nothing. Then I heard something knock against a tree. Not hard, just one dull thud. Then silence again. I crouched behind a rock, rifle ready, heart hammering in my chest. I waited. 30 minutes passed. Nothing. Then a branch snapped behind me. closer than I expected. I spun around and aimed, but saw nothing in the dark. I held still for what felt like hours. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then I heard what I still can't explain. A small rustling sound, right behind the tent, then nothing. I packed up before dawn, threw everything into the truck without even folding the tent. I didn't eat, didn't look back. I just drove. The forest road seemed longer than before. Every shadow between trees made me grip the wheel tighter. By the time I hit pavement, I felt like I had escaped something. I made it to a gas station near Flagstaff and just sat in the lot for a long time, trying to calm myself. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't tell anyone the full story for years. A few weeks later, I went online and looked up missing persons reports in that area. Found 3 in the last 5 years. One was a guy who vanished from a hunting trip just 20 miles from where I had camped. Another was a woman hiking solo. The third was a couple, last seen driving into the woods. Their truck was found, camp intact, no sign of them. I still don't know what I heard. I never saw anything, never got proof. But I know I wasn't alone out there. And whatever it wasn't curious. It was watching. I haven't camped alone since. I still hike, still spend time in the woods, but never off-grid, never without signal. Some places don't want you there. Some places have been quiet too long. And sometimes silence isn't peaceful. It's warning you. I was 31 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. It was late summer of 2014. My girlfriend and I had broken up a few months earlier, and I'd been stuck in this weird emotional fog, sleeping in late, scrolling endlessly through my phone, watching too much TV. I needed something to break the cycle, something simple, just me and nature. No phone, no music, just silence and air and trees. I live in Kent, down in the southeast of England, but for this trip, I picked a small spot up in the forest of Bowland, Lancashire. It's not as tourist-heavy as the Lake District, and I'd read online that there were lots of quiet places where wild camping was tolerated if you kept a low profile. I packed up my gear, cheap but reliable tent, sleeping bag, basic stove, tinned food, water, compass, headlamp, lighter, a decent fixed-blade knife, and a few other essentials. I drove up in my old Volkswagen Golf, parked it along a country lane near a farming village called Newton in Bowland, and walked the rest of the way in. The spot I picked was a small clearing near a riverbed, a good 25-minute hike from the nearest visible path. I didn't see a single soul after the first 10 minutes of walking. No other campers.
No hikers.
Not even a farmer. The riverbed was low and mostly dry, just patches of shallow water weaving around smooth stones and fallen branches. Behind it was a line of thick trees, and behind them, the land sloped up into some rocky hills. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. I set up my tent around 4 p.m., boiled some water for tea, and sat on a flat rock near the river, watching the trees sway. It was everything I wanted.
No noise.
No pressure. Just the sounds of insects and wind and the trickling water. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders drop and my mind settle. As night fell, I lit a small fire in a circle of stones I had built. I roasted a few sausages I'd brought, ate a can of beans, and lay back on my mat, looking at the sky. There were more stars than I ever saw back home. It got cold quickly, so I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped up the tent. My plan was to stay out here for 3 nights, maybe 4 if I felt up to it. I woke up around 3 a.m. that first night because I had to piss. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, half asleep. The fire had burned out. The cold hit me like a slap. Everything was dark and dead silent, the kind of silence that hums in your ears. I walked a little into the trees to relieve myself, using my headlamp on its lowest setting. That's when I felt something strange. Not saw felt, like a weight behind my ribs. I turned the light off and stood still. It was completely black. No moon, no stars through the trees. Just black and the faint sound of the river. There was nothing there. I told myself that and went back to the tent. But something in me had tightened. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about the quiet, how even the birds weren't making noise. The next day, I hiked around the area, looking at some nearby rock formations, just keeping my mind busy. By the afternoon, I was more relaxed again. I made a small stew for dinner and sat by the fire, watching steam drift off the metal pot. At some point, I looked across the riverbed. On the other side, right near the edge of the trees, I saw something, a shape. I thought it might have been a deer or a large dog at first, low to the ground, but still. I blinked a few times. It didn't move. I got up and took a few steps closer, but the firelight didn't reach that far. I thought maybe I was seeing a bush or a stump or a boulder that caught the light funny. But the weird thing was, I didn't remember seeing anything there earlier. I stayed close to camp that night. I didn't sleep much again. The silence was even heavier, like the air was full of dust. I could barely hear the river anymore. I kept imagining footsteps outside the tent. Not loud stomps, just slow, careful steps. I kept sitting up and unzipping the flap, but every time, I saw nothing. I started leaving my knife under my sleeping bag. On the third day, I made a decision. I wouldn't stay for the fourth night. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I trusted my gut. It wasn't fear exactly, more like tension that wouldn't let go, like being watched from far away. That evening, I packed up most of my stuff, except the tent and what I needed for the night. I planned to wake up early and hike back to the car by sunrise. I went to sleep early. I tried to block everything out and just force my body to shut down. I must have drifted off around 10 or 11. I woke up again in the middle of the night, but this time it wasn't because I had to piss. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. I just woke up all at once, heart pounding, like someone had grabbed me. I lay there completely still, eyes open in the dark. I heard a sound, a scraping sound, like metal dragging across stone. Came from across the riverbed. Then it stopped. I slowly reached over and unzipped the inner tent flap just a little, enough to slide my hand out. I grabbed the knife. Then I unzipped the outer flap, just a bit. I waited, 10 seconds, 20. Then I heard it again, a slow scrape, and this time a crunch of a footstep. Not close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but definite. Couldn't breathe right. My lungs weren't working properly. My mouth felt like it was full of dust. I pushed the flap open and looked out. My fire was just glowing embers now. Then, in that faint orange glow, I saw something at the far end of the clearing. It was a man, not walking, not moving. He was crouched down by the edge of the river on my side. I hadn't heard him cross. He wasn't doing anything, just crouched there, arms on his knees, face turned straight at my tent. I pulled the flap closed slowly and sat there. I couldn't think clearly. Every instinct I had was screaming not to move, not to make a sound. Then I heard him stand, that soft, slow shift of weight. Another footstep, then another, closer now. I got out of the sleeping bag and crouched with the knife. I didn't want to run. Running blind into the woods would be worse. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want him to know I was awake. The footsteps stopped just a few feet from the tent. Then silence again. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Couldn't tell. My legs were shaking. My teeth were clenched so tight I thought they might crack. Then, suddenly, a shadow moved over the tent wall. A hand just rested there. He was touching the tent, pressing it gently. Then he walked around it. I saw the shadows shift. Then nothing. No footsteps walking away.
No sounds.
I waited. I must have sat like that for an hour. Finally, when the sky started to turn faint gray-blue, I packed everything up silently. I didn't even roll up the tent. I just grabbed what I could, stuffed it into the bag, and left the tent behind. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just walked. I got to my car and drove. I didn't look in the mirrors. I just kept my eyes forward. My hands shook the whole drive back to Kent. For a while, I thought maybe I imagined it, that I'd freaked myself out. But 2 weeks later, I read a small article online about a missing hiker up near Newton and Boland. A solo camper. Tent found slashed to pieces. No signs of struggle. No blood. Just gone. I don't know if it was the same place I camped, but it was close. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still go with friends sometimes in proper campsites with phone reception and lights and other people around. But I'll never forget that feeling. The way he crouched there, still, watching, waiting, and how quiet everything was, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I never liked camping with other people. They were always too loud or too messy, or forgot something important like water or a flashlight or even toilet paper. I was 32 when I started going out into the hills of northern Arizona on my own, and it quickly became one of the few things that brought me peace. I lived in a little town called Clarkdale. It's tucked between Jerome and Cottonwood, not far from Sedona, but quieter than all of them. You could walk out your door and be in the foothills in minutes. I worked construction during the week, roofing mostly, and saved all my days off for weekends in the wild. The red rocks, dry creeks, endless juniper trees. They made my head quiet in a way the town never could. I always camped rough. No big tents or radios or coolers full of beer. Just a tarp, a bedroll, a small gas stove, a cheap pack, and a 9mm Glock I kept tucked under my sleeping bag. I didn't bring it because I was afraid of bears or mountain lions. I brought it because you never really know who else might be out there. I remember the weekend like it was yesterday, even though it's been 4 years. It was mid-September, 2021. The heat was finally breaking. Days were warm but not unbearable, and nights were crisp. Perfect weather for a long hike. I drove north on 89A toward Flagstaff and turned off near a little forest road that wasn't even marked. I'd found it a year before and saved it in my GPS. It led to a spot you couldn't see from the road. No fire rings, no trash, no signs of people at all. Just pine trees and red dirt and the occasional mule deer trail winding through the undergrowth. I parked where the road gave out and hiked in with everything on my back. Took about 2 hours to get to my usual spot. It was a little hollow between two ridges, shaded by big ponderosa pines, with a sloping rock wall to one side that helped block the wind. I set up my tarp between two trees, cleared out pine needles, and rolled out my bedroll. I boiled water for freeze-dried chili, made a fire, and sat in the dirt, staring at the flames until the sun dipped low behind the trees. The first night was quiet, cold but not bad. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the trees, and nothing strange happened. I slept hard and woke early, made instant coffee, packed a small bag, and set out to explore the ridge to the north. I was gone most of the day, climbed over deadfall, followed deer tracks, found an old dried-out creek. The land out there looks empty from the road, but when you're deep in it, the woods are full of movement. Lizards, birds, the occasional distant rustle of something bigger. When I got back around dusk, everything was where I left it. Pack, tarp, even my water bottle. I made a fire and cooked again. Sat watching the flames until full dark, then tucked into my sleeping bag with the Glock by my side, just like always. That night is when things started to feel wrong. I woke up sometime after midnight. It wasn't a noise that did it. I just opened my eyes like something inside me had nudged me awake. The fire had died down to embers. The forest was completely still. No wind, no crickets, not even the usual creak of trees shifting in the cold. Just dead silence. Took me a minute to realize I wasn't alone. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see anyone, but I knew something was near my camp. It was that feeling you get when someone stands behind you in line too close, even if you haven't turned around yet. Every hair on my neck stood up. My chest got tight. I stayed in my bag and reached slowly for the Glock. Then I heard it, very faint movement, like a foot dragging through leaves, just beyond the edge of the firelight. Too heavy for a rabbit or squirrel, too slow for a deer. I held my breath and listened. Another shuffle, closer this time. I sat up and clicked on my flashlight, swung it around the trees in front of me. Nothing. The beam lit up bark and pine needles and the edge of the boulder to my left, but there wasn't anyone there. I stood slowly, still in my socks, and took a few steps away from the fire. My breath showed in the cold. I swept the light in a full circle. Still nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. I stood there for maybe a full minute, listening, not moving. Then I backed toward my bedroll, sat down again, and kept the flashlight and the gun in my lap until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I told myself in the morning it had just been a deer, but I didn't believe it. The next day I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to camp, rearranged my tarp so I could see in every direction, gathered extra wood, spent the afternoon sharpening my hatchet and reading an old paperback I'd brought. Every so often I would stop and listen. The forest still sounded normal in the daytime. Wind through trees, the buzz of flies, birdsong. But under that there was something else, a quiet tension, like the trees were watching me. That night I built the fire high, kept it burning longer than usual, ate my food fast and cleaned up every trace, packed everything into my bag except the sleeping gear and gun. I lay there for hours listening, and then, just after 2 a.m., I heard a sound I'll never forget. It was my name, not whispered, not shouted, just said in a flat, weird tone, like someone trying to speak through a mouth that didn't work right. It came from the woods behind me, where the rock wall cast deep shadows even in the firelight. Said it once, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't turn around. I stared into the fire and tried not to breathe. Then I heard it again, closer, my name, but it wasn't right. It had the wrong rhythm, like whoever or whatever said it didn't understand what it meant. Then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching through dry pine needles, coming closer. I stood, gun raised, and spun around. Nothing. I pointed the flashlight in the direction of the voice. Still nothing. But I didn't imagine it. I swear on my life I heard it. Something in those woods said my name, and it didn't sound human. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed everything. Fast. Didn't even make coffee. Just threw my gear together and started the hike back to the truck. The trail looked different on the way out. I'd walked it 2 days before and knew every bend, but now things were wrong. Trees in different places, rocks I didn't remember. I started to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn. Then I saw footprints. Not mine, not boot prints. Bare feet, bare human feet. But the toes were long, too long, and the prints didn't look right. The heel shape was wrong, and they weren't just crossing the trail, they were following it. Following the same path I was taking. I sped up, didn't stop for water, didn't stop to check the GPS, just kept walking, faster and faster, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The sun was up, but it didn't help. Every shadow between the trees looked like something hiding. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't even put the gear in the bed. I threw it in the passenger seat and peeled out, gravel spraying from the tires. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement again. When I got home, I showered twice, locked every door, slept with the lights on. For days I kept checking outside at night, thinking I'd see something standing in the yard, but nothing came. I didn't go camping again for 6 months. When I finally did, it was with 2 friends, and I brought a rifle as well as the Glock. But I never went back to that spot. Never even got close. I spent a lot of time reading after that. Not just regular stuff, folklore, local legends. I didn't believe in that kind of thing before. Skinwalkers, shapeshifters, witches. Sounded like movie nonsense. But some stories were too close to what I'd seen. People who'd heard their own names spoken in the woods. People who'd followed trails that shifted around them. People who saw things pretending to be human, but not quite managing it. I stopped telling myself I imagined it. I didn't. I don't know what I saw or what saw me, but it was out there in the hills near Clarkdale. And it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything that belonged in those woods. I've never gone camping alone again. I never will. And if you ever hear your own name whispered by something you can't see, run.